There's a good reason why everyone should be able to build a simple to-do app. It includes creating, reading, updating, and deleting. You've also got some basic UI things as well to pay attention to. That's what we're going to do in today's video. Here's the actual project over here, and you can see that as I add like to do 1 or to do 2, these things are perpetuated, and I can actually hover. You get this nice little state here. Delete items. If I refresh, they stay because we're going to store them in local storage. And all of this happens with just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I hope that this tutorial will include something for everyone. So over here, you'll see this is all the HTML we're going to write. So there's not a ton to talk about here, but there are a couple little nice things to work through. We've also got the CSS, where we'll talk about templating and using these variables to make your entire site way more modular and kind of set up a design system. In addition to that, we'll use some other things like OKLCH values. If you're not familiar with those, we'll also use a couple other helpful like helpers, like here's a min function that we'll also use. We'll talk about margin inline and margin block. So there's a couple of things that even if you're familiar with CSS, you may pick up as we go. We use some newer things like CSS nesting, and we'll also use is functions as well. And the entire checkbox experience we'll do by creating a fake little checkbox, but make it accessible to screen readers by the way we set all this stuff up. Now really where the magic comes in place is this JavaScript. And you'll see not only are we going to render the to-dos using JavaScript, and they'll have a lot of helpers in here that will allow us to check these off and store them in local storage, but we're going to be firing off custom events that render the UI separately, kind of apart from the rest of our code. That way we have a really nice separation between the actual data and the rendering of that data. Now there's a lot of cool things we'll talk about here, and so even if you're familiar with JavaScript, I hope this will be helpful for you. One last thing, I actually challenged myself to do this when I was on a train ride recently without internet. I just had a few minutes and I thought, let me see what I could do if I were to start from scratch with just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And that's where this tutorial came from. Well, I hope this is a big help. I can't wait to jump in. You ready? Let's go. Hey, what's up? My name is Chris and welcome to Coding in Public. We're going to start from the very basics here. And you can see here, I have a folder called New, and I've just opened this up in VS Code over here. So you can do the same thing, and then we're going to add a simple file called index.html. Now, again, I'm kind of assuming that you have the basics down, and this is kind of your first real practice application. So with that said, we're going to use the exclamation point, and if you hit enter here, there's something called emit. You don't need to know really what it does, but basically it will help scaffold things out. In this case, it's going to scaffold out the core content of an HTML page. Let's just come over here. We're going to change this to say something like to-do app. Okay, so this is our to-do app, and I can get this up and running with a special extension we have. If I jump over here to the extensions and you search for live server, it should look like this and have like 64 million downloads or so. Install that, and it'll add a little button at the bottom of your page. Now with the index.html file open and this basic stuff scaffolded out, if you click go live, it'll actually spin up a server at port 5500. So you could just enter in localhost 5500. It should actually open it up for you as well. Here, I've already got mine open up. Okay, so let's come over here. We're going to add the basics that we need. Now, there's a lot we could get bogged down with, but I do want to talk a little bit about accessibility as we go. First, we're going to put everything inside of a main tag. This tells assistive devices and even crawlers like Google where the core content of your site is. Then inside here, we're going to have an H1. This is the largest of the headings, and we're going to have this say my to-do app. Now, by using an H1, the browser automatically assigns a larger text to this. The important thing, though, is which tag we're using. You should only ever have one H1 per page, and then you can have multiple H2s for different sections, H3s below that. Think about it like a table of contents. This is going to be the main thing on that page, and then as you have different sections, you can have subsections of that main thing. So you should only ever have one H1. You can have multiple H2s. The H3 should be under the H2s, kind of structurally in the page. And that's really important for screen readers, especially because it tells them what the content of your page is all about. Now, because I don't want to have to tie the size of fonts to the actual tags, I'm going to also add a class. This will allow us to select it later in HTML, and I like to use the same idea, H1, H2, H3, all the way through H6. And those are my font sizes that I set by classes, and that way I don't have to rely on which tag I'm using. I can just select the class I need, and that way my tags and my styling can be separate. Okay, so with that said, below here we're going to have a section, and this semantic tag is a section on the page. Now by default it doesn't really do anything, and we'll explain that in a second. But for now, just know that down below here we're going to have a form, and then below the form we're going to have a UL. So let's kind of scaffold this out one thing at a time. So if I come in here to the action, we're going to get rid of this and handle all that with JavaScript. But in order to select this in JavaScript, I need to give it a special ID. IDs are only ever used once per page. In fact, if you use it more than that, it'll just select the very first one. So an ID selects an individual item on your page. We're going to do the same thing for the UL, which is an unordered list. We're going to give it an ID, and this will be where we put all of our to-dos. Developers do different things here, but generally speaking, I like to select items on the page in JavaScript using IDs because they're unique. And then if I want to style them, I'll use classes. So my classes are used in CSS. My IDs are typically used in JavaScript. So I'm going to call this to-do wrapper here. And then we're not going to style the form directly. We're going to style the input, so I won't worry about adding a class there. But speaking of inputs, we're going to add an input, and by default, it sets it as type of text. And you can see it actually shows up right here. So it already knows what I need, but I need to add a couple of extra things here as well. I want to make sure that this is required because I don't want somebody to submit the form without actually filling it out. Next, we can add a little placeholder. This will tell it, kind of add that ghost text here. We'll say something like your to do. Right? That way people know what to do, and you can see right here, it says your to do. Now there's a couple of other things we can add. I'm going to add autofocus right here. What this will do is if I save it and I come over here and I just refresh the page, it will automatically put my cursor there and start blinking. So it makes it quicker to input tasks. And by default, it will try to autocomplete based on other things you've entered in task fields. That would not work really well for a to-do application, so I want to turn off autocomplete. So we've got autocomplete, and I'll set this to off. Now there's just one final thing I want, and that is I want to be able to select this when I submit the form. One of the nice ways to do that is by giving this a name. Now this is like an ID, but it's kind of scoped to the form to where you're saying, hey, when I submit this form, find me something that has this particular name. And you should typically only have one per form. That's kind of the idea here, is that this input is named to do. Now I know that to do is what this field is all about. We've got just one more thing to do in the HTML before we move over to CSS, but I want to first of all look a little bit more into this section tag. I mentioned that it kind of sets off a section, but if I come over here, you'll notice, even though it's here, if I use the accessibility tree, which you can click this little icon to see, you'll see there's no real delineation. Everything's inside of main. Now, if you don't see the accessibility tree, you can do Command-Shift-P and then select accessibility and just make sure you've shown accessibility. Now with that, you should be able to click here and get the same kind of thing. What we can do is give this a special label that kind of sets this apart as its own section. So there's a few different ways to do this. A lot of times you can add an H2 or something like that inside of this section to kind of set that off and then point its ID here. But what we're going to do is a little simpler than that. If you add an ARIA label, you can simply label this and say what the section should be about. Now in this case, it's kind of what the whole page is about, so this may not be the best example, but we could say something like to-do, form, and a list. And now you'll notice over here, I've got this set off as a region. So here under my main tag, I have a heading, and then I have this region that holds my to-do form and my list. So these ARIA labels are really helpful, again, not just for screen readers and assistive devices, but also for Google as they crawl your page so they know exactly what each section in your page is all about. All right, so that's all the HTML we're going to do. Now it's time to add a little CSS. So let's come over this way. I'm going to add a new file. We could call this, let's just call it index.css. That should work. We're going to fill out a few things here, but in order to connect this to the page, we need to actually add it up top here. So typically what I do is I want to put this below the title so the title can load in first. This is not going to be a large amount of CSS, so not a huge deal here. But if you do link:/CSS, it'll actually add that for you directly. And if you call it index, you should change it to index like I did here. That way you don't have to remember how to type all this out, just link:/ and then CSS. All right, so now this is actually hooked up. And if I close this down over here, we jump over to the CSS. I could, for instance, grab my body and just to make sure it's working, we could set the background color to blue. And yeah, that works. I mean, kind of. It doesn't really work, but you know. Now what I want to do is paste in a couple of things and we'll talk through this. Now you'll see here I'm saying select everything and then select all the afters and all the before elements. We're going to add box sizing border box. This gets rid of some weird default behavior in browsers, and so typically you do that. I'm also going to get rid of all the margins and the paddings. Now that's a bit of an opinionated choice, but I'd rather control that than let the browser kind of set that up. And then finally, we just have the font family. If you start to type system UI like this is what comes out. So I didn't type all that out. So we've added 4 different items here in CSS. Now, I typically like to use what's called the root. This is essentially the HTML. And for this HTML, I like to set up variables. Now, even though we're working in CSS, you've got access now in modern CSS to variables. Those variables let you basically define all the different smaller parts of your CSS and then apply them later on in your CSS. So in other words, instead of typing over and over again, like font size, I don't know, like 2 rem. Instead, what I can do is use variables up top here. And if I ever want to change my application, I can change all the variables in my root and the whole site will update because they're all going to reference these same variables. Hopefully that makes sense. What I typically like to do is to set up a couple of basics. So let me paste those in and we'll walk through them. All right, don't get overwhelmed. There's just a few things we've added and we'll talk through these one after the other. Now to do a variable in CSS, you need this double dash and then you can name it whatever you want. In this case, I have FS for font size and then small, medium, and large. So that way I've got these predefined up top. Now I've done the same thing with colors here, but you'll notice this doesn't actually reflect any color scheme. That's because I typically like to use HSL values or OKLab values. I don't want to get too much into the details there, but essentially this allows us to use a wrapper function where we can apply opacity kind of as we need to. So instead of talking that out, I'll show you in a second, but just add all these background, text, and accent. And I start them with color so I know what they are. Then finally, we've got some spacing variables, space 2, space 3, and space 4. We can use these throughout the application as we need to. And then I've got some radiuses like rounded small and rounded medium. And finally, a checkbox size, which we'll use to define the checkbox size. So by setting up these up front here, and you can grab these from the code linked below, or if you want to type them out, that's fine as well. These will allow us to then scaffold out the rest of this CSS without having to manually retype these or make sure we're using the same values. Plus, if we ever want to update our site, you don't have to do it by going through every single area where you've used them. Instead, you can just change these right here and the entire site will be updated. For instance, like colors, you can just change the colors right away. Okay, so with that said, let's come down here and start to actually build out the core of the CSS here. And I'm going to start with the body tag. And here I want to start by setting a max width here, and we're just going to do 1200 pixels. Now this could also be another variable up top, but since this is like a one-time declaration on the body, I'm fine adding it right here. We want to make sure that this stays in the middle, so we can use the margin inline option and just set this to auto. Inline means left and right. Let's add some padding here. This should be 2 rem up top, and we're going to add just 1 rem on the side. And that way, as we get to smaller screen sizes, so if I come down here, you can see that it's not like super spaced out here, but we've got a little more space up top. All right, a couple other things I want to add as kind of global declarations on the whole body. We want to add the background color here, and here's where that color property really comes in. So we're going to actually use HSL, and then we're going to wrap our variable. So if I come in here, I can use the var keyword, and then notice I've got all these kind of showing up in my IntelliSense. I just want to use the background color. Now, as soon as I do that, it actually applies. It's hard to see, so let's switch over to the text. See, obviously not the color we want, but you can now actually see the effect. Now, the cool thing is because I've used this variable and I've just added the numbers up here, I have not added the wrapper of HSL, I can come in here later and do a / like 0.2 and get opacity kind of as I go. We'll use this a few times throughout the site, and that way we can define these kind of relative opacities when we need to, but the color stays essentially the same. So hopefully that makes sense of why we've done that. And it's just my preferred way of working, and it gives you a lot more flexibility. So we'll come in here now with a color of background like that. Okay, cool. Finally, I want to use color. This is the font color, and we're going to do the same thing where we'll use HSL, var, and then we're going to use the color text. Now, we've basically got white and basically got black, just a little offset on both of those, so there's not a massive change. We'll see a change in a bit when we add some accent color. Finally, let's add a font size. And for here, we can just say var font size medium. So this will be the base font size for the whole site. Now, we've got this H1, so that's the next thing I want to style. Now, you might remember that we added a special class over here called H1, and that way we can kind of keep the tag H1 separate from the styling for the largest of our font size. But I'm going to name that H1 as well here. So let's come inside here. We're going to say font size, and then I'm going to set this to var font size like this. And we'll choose the large option. The next section I want to style is the form section. So right over here, we want to style this. Now, I haven't given this any kind of selector, so let's go ahead and do this. Let's add a class. We'll just call it wrapper. And that way, we can kind of use this as the global wrapper for this section. You could name that whatever you want, but that's what I'll name it. So I'll come down this way. We can just select the class like that, wrapper. We've got 2 items inside of here, but it's kind of hard to see this. So let's come back over here. I'm going to add some manually here that we'll remove in a second. I'm going to paste a bunch of stuff in here. You're not going to have to do this. I just want to be able to style this so you can actually see what we're doing. So this is what each to-do will look like structurally. We're going to add this later in JavaScript, so you don't have to type this in now, but I want you to be able to see kind of what we're separating. In this case, what we're separating in this wrapper is this UL this unordered list of to-dos, and the form, which is just the input. So I want to kind of space those out. There's a couple different ways we could do this, but I usually like to use display grid. This will set it up as grid children. So the form and this UL are kind of children of this grid wrapper. Now in grid elements, you can separate those elements by using some kind of gap variable. In this case, we've got our nice little space helpers. So let's set this at space 4, and that way we'll space those out by that amount. Hopefully you saw that move. Now I also want to set a max width for the entire wrapper. And here we're just going to do a hard-coded value of 275. There's a couple different ways we could select the form. If you come back over here, you'll notice we did not give it a class, and that's because I want to show you a few different things we can do. Here I have an ID. I could select the ID if I want. However, in modern CSS, you can also nest certain items. Now, I will say nest very carefully because you can really get in some trouble if you over nest. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to come inside here and we're simply going to select the form. Now, what I'm saying is inside of the wrapper class, the form element that exists should be styled this way. We're going to set the width to 100%. This essentially ensures that it will be as wide as possible, which means in a second, once we actually change the input, the actual input field to be 100% width, it will then take up the 100% width of the form, which is taking up the full wrapper space. So that being said, we have this to-do input right here. Now we could continue to nest this. We could come down inside here and we could nest and say any input that's inside the form, do this too. The trouble is now this is scoped super heavily inside of the wrapper and inside of the form, and therefore it can be really difficult to actually use it in multiple places on your site. So typically I like to go maybe one level deep, and that's about it, because after that you end up having to kind of rewrite a lot of code. So it would be better in this case to say anytime I have a type of text input, so anytime I have an input that's a type of text, wherever it appears on my site, I always want it to look the same way. Now, if I come back over here, you'll notice that we've got type of text. I can use this attribute selector inside of brackets. So if I just add it just like this, this allows me to select that particular attribute. And here we can set a bunch of different things that would work wherever I use an input on my entire site that is the type of text. Now, as you learn more, you may want this to be less or more specific. In this case, I think it works well for this site. Now, by default, inputs have weird text things, so I usually like just to take the font and say inherit everything from the body instead of doing your weird stuff, and notice it now looks like the rest of my body font, which is what I want. Now, we're also going to add a border here where we'll have 1 pixel solid, and then I want to add in a color. We're going to use our text color, but at a little bit of an opacity. So if I come over here, we add it like this. So that's an HSL wrapper around the variable. Now I can add opacity with a /0.4. We also want to add a border radius. And again, I've got nice helpers here. Now I am typing var and then doing that each time. You can actually just do a double dash and then start typing like rounded, and that will wrap your whole thing in var. Now I want the background of this to be the same as the background of my page, and it's just slightly off. So I'm just going to grab the background right here to make this a little easier on us. We'll just drop it in there. Right now, if you go to type in here, you get no space around the characters, and that just gives me claustrophobia. So let's come here and add some padding. And once again, up top, we're going to change the kind of spacing on this. We'll take a var, or again, we can use our double dash trick and just choose space 3, and then we'll use space 4, so that up and down it's space 3 and over it's space 4. I mentioned before that by setting the form to 100% width, we can now take the input and do the same. So let's do that. It should take the full width. I actually don't know that we need this here. Let's actually check because it is a grid child. Yeah, we don't actually need that. So much for all my talking about nesting. We'll do that in a second here. Finally, I'm going to transition on a few things because as we select those, we're going to add a box shadow. So let's add box shadow. We'll do 200 milliseconds, ease in and out. What this does is it selects a particular type of transition only, sets the time it takes, and then sets the easing. In this case, we're going to say, make it real smooth, ease in and ease out. Now, speaking of nesting, let's get back to that. If we want to nest inside of here, this is a great use case for nesting. I will almost always do nesting this way with inputs or anytime I'm focusing on or hovering on something. So by using the ampersand, this actually selects this right here. It's the same thing as retyping that there. Well, actually, you wouldn't want to retype it because then it would be saying a text input inside of a text input. But here it's selecting the parent. So with the ampersand, I'm going to say anytime I focus on the ampersand. So anytime I focus on this input field. Now let's get rid of that just for a second to see what the default behavior is. You can see here, let's zoom up just a touch. You've got this blue dark outline. That kind of comes standard, right, in browsers. I want to actually remove that and add my own custom one. Now, typically the easiest thing to do is to remove the outline that happens We don't want to remove the whole thing, so I just want to change the color to transparent. So if I reselect, you'll notice I don't see the color anymore. However, when I do select it with the keyboard, I want to make sure that it is focus visible. It's really important to re-add this in, because if you have a hard time seeing and you go to select this, you have no idea that this little tiny cursor is blinking. So by adding some kind of ring, it really helps everyone, not just those struggling with eyesight, see exactly what they've selected. So I'm going to come inside here. We're going to have box shadow, and here's where I want to add 0, 0, 0, and then we'll use the 0.1 EM. This uses the font size to set the kind of width of this border we're going to add, and I simply want to add HSL, and we're going to use background. In this case, I want to use the accent. Now notice if I come in here now and select, I've got my nice custom background color, and it's even nice and smooth because of this transition right here. Now I could also change the border color if I wanted to as well. So I could say border color, and again, we could wrap this all in an accent like this, so that now the border color changes along with that. Now it's not doing it at the same easing, but I'm okay with that because we're just easing off the box shadow. So now it's very clear when I've selected this, either with my cursor or when I've selected it with tabbing to that input. We're gonna have a to-do wrapper like this, where I'll do display grid again, and then we'll do a gap of R3, or space 3. So eventually, as I have multiple to-dos here, it will separate them out by this spacing variable. Now, the only thing we've got left to style is this whole thing, but I want to wait until we get this actually coming in with JavaScript so we can see it kind of for ourselves. So I'm going to come back over this way and remove this extra stuff. I told you didn't need to add it quite yet, like that. And that way we're kind of back as you were. Now, I do want to add JavaScript to this page, and we're going to use JavaScript to where whenever you input here and hit enter, it'll then save it. Now, by default, you'll notice it actually adds it to the page. It posts it to the page, and you see to do equals whatever. Now, where's it getting this to do from? Well, you might remember over here in the input that we gave this a name of to do, and that's one of the things that we'll do is it will tag that and say, hey, you've submitted a form. Here's the name of the item you've submitted. In fact, if we had multiple things, so if I came here, we copy this down, and we say like to do to, and I added both of these, oops, like this, and then we hit enter. I guess we need a button here, so we'll say button. Submit. When you have just one, you can hit enter and it submits it automatically. If you don't, then you'll see it here. I've got to do, but over here I've also got to do too. So it's actually grabbed both of those because of these names. Now you may actually want to add a button in here yourself, like a little arrow or something when you hit click. You're welcome to do that if you want to. You can also just leave it here with one input. If you hit enter, it automatically submits it. Now let's get rid of all that junk. It's not going to hurt us, but that way we can see exactly whether or not we're submitting to the page or not. Okay, because we actually want to block that default behavior. So I'm going to come back over here, and we're going to add one more thing, and this is just going to be, let's just do index.js. We've already done index for everything else. Why not here as well? Now just to make sure that this is actually working, let's console log something. So we'll just say like hi. And then we have to hook this up to the page just like we did the CSS. There's a few different places you can add this script. Typically you add it right before the end of the closing body tag, or you can actually add it in the head if you want to, as long as you add the type of module. So if I come in here with script and do the type of module, and I just want this to be at index.js. Okay, so now if I come back over here and we look at the console, yep, it says hi. So that means it's actually loading in for us. Okay, cool. So let's think through what we want this to do. We'll kind of do this in stages because now we're in the logic section of the project where we need to logically think through how do we want this to break down. So generally speaking, what I want to do is select a few things. So we're going to select the form. And by default, when we submit the form, I want to make sure that we add a to-do. So that's the very basic. So let's start there. We're just going to start by having all of our selectors up top. So let's just say these are our query selectors. So to start with, I just want to grab the form itself. So we'll say to-do form. And here we need some kind of selector to grab that one. Now, if I come back over here, you might remember I do have an ID called to-do form. So I should be able to grab that. We'll say document.querySelector, and I'm just going to select the ID of to-do form. Now, next we're going to come down this way, and we want to make sure we have an event listener. In other words, when certain events happen, do things. In this case, when this submit happens, I want to add a to-do. Now we've got a lot more to add about what that to-do will have to be added to, but for now, let's just grab the to-do form that we selected, and we're going to add an event listener. Now the event we're going to listen for is actually the submit event. Anytime this form submits by clicking enter, or even if you add a button and click the button, this will be fired as well. I want to do certain something. So in this case, let's grab that event. We're just going to call it E. Basically, the browser will send along the event, and so we can name this whatever we want. We can name it like pickles if we want to, but I'm going to name it E because pickles is not very common. All right, so let's come inside here, and then we're going to do something with this event. By default, like I mentioned, we want to actually prevent the default. In this method, you do have to add this these parentheses to actually call this. This will stop it from submitting to the page. So now if I come in here and say something and hit enter, it will not submit. It doesn't do anything because we've prevented it right here. Now, why would we want to do that? If you were building a really robust application, you'd want to find a way to handle this. First of all, using the browser kind of native implementation, and then add JavaScript as kind of an extra. In this case, like our whole application is going to depend on JavaScript, so we want to make sure that we prevent it and then do everything we want with JavaScript, and that gives us full control over how this form submits. Now it's time to think through how we want to store this. Now every browser comes default with local storage. In Chrome, if I come over here and look at application, and I look at local storage right here, you'll see that we actually have something under local storage. Let's make this a little bit bigger. You can have a key and a value pair, and this will be kind of held here in the browser for a certain length of time. It actually depends on the browser. I think Safari is only like 6 days. So this is not a great long-term storage solution, but at least for now, for a simple application like this, it's like a little tiny database that lives temporarily in the browser. So we're going to use that as we add stuff. So let's think through the logic again of what we're going to do. So the first thing I want to do is get existing ones. Then I want to get the new to-do. Then I want to combine them. Then I want to resave. And then finally, I want to update the UI somehow. Okay, so that's kind of the steps we're going to take. Now, to get the existing to-dos, we may need to do this in a couple of different places. So it may be helpful for us to have a helper function. So let's come up top here. We're going to have like helpers. Let's say const, and I'm just going to do this as an arrow function. We'll call this get local as JSON. Now I'm saying as JSON because by default, this value is just going to be a string, but if I want to add to it, I need it to be some kind of structured output. So let's add a key right here. So we're going to pass in a specific key, and whatever key we get, we're going to then return that item from local storage. Now I can actually do this all in one go here and just use an implicit return. So I can take a local storage.getItem. This is a method that exists here, and it takes in one argument. The argument here is the key, and you can see that right here. And we already named ours key, so let's just pass in key right here. So whatever you name it here, you have to pass it in here. We're just saying whatever we've passed in, send it along to the local storage.getItem. Now, if I go ahead and do that like this, and we get the local storage item here, let's come down here and let's try to grab that. So we'll say like existing to-dos equals get local as JSON, and we'll pass in the key of to-dos. Okay, so it's going to look inside here and try to find that. And then let's go ahead and console log this like that. So I'll come over here, and as I enter in something and I submit something, it's going to try, first of all, it's going to prevent the default, then it's going to try to get whatever is in the local storage. Notice it says null because nothing exists there. Well, I need to actually have something returned aside from null. So we want to do a little check here to see if this exists, then pass it back as some kind of structured output. Otherwise, create something like an empty array. So again, we've got a couple of different options, but we can just have a little ternary here. Now, you could also do this with an if statement if you prefer, but a ternary is a little cleaner here in my opinion. We're saying if this exists, we're going to use what's called a ternary structure. Now, a ternary says if something is true, do this, otherwise do this. And you mark it with these two symbols. So first of all, what happens if it's true? So if it's true, I simply want to return whatever is in the local storage, but I want to parse that. In other words, I want to turn it back into JSON. That's just why we're saying get local as JSON. So we'll say JSON.parse. This is something that comes built in JavaScript. And then we're just going to simply pass back in the local storage get item key, right? So if it exists, pass it back as JSON. Otherwise, I just want you to pass back an empty array. So now if I come back and say something, I should get what? Well, there's nothing there. So it should just be an empty array. And in fact, that's exactly what I get, an empty array. So now I know I'm getting some kind of structured output, either the items that were in there in a structured output or as an empty array. So let's come down here and we're going to then get the new to-do next. Now, one of the other advantages of using the name right here is that we can pick this off using what's called the form data API. This is another thing we get built in JavaScript. So we could call this new to-do or whatever we want, but I can just simply pass in new form data, and then we can pass in the name of the form. Now we've got the form right here, so let's just use that. We selected that up top, right? So it's saying, hey, whenever this form is submitted, use this form data API to grab all the things that have a name attached to them. Now that will give it to me in a kind of weird structure, so I actually want to pick off just one item, and that is my to-do. Now, why am I saying to do? Well, that's because over here, this says to do. So the name is to do. This is the one I want to pick off. So now I have my existing to-dos and I have my new to-dos. So next we need to combine them. So let's call this something like updated to-dos. And here again, we've got a few options. I'm simply going to use the spread syntax because this is the easiest to kind of understand. We're going to say we're taking an empty array and I want to spread in with 3 dots here, the existing to-dos. Now these existing to-dos will be my either an empty array or my current structure. And by spreading it in, I'm saying, hey, get rid of the outer wrapper and just drop each of the items inside here. So that's the first thing. And then at the end of that array, I want you to add the new to-do. Now this new to-do should have more than just the name. Actually, I'm going to have several items that we save each time we save it to do. So I want it to be its own little object. So I'm going to add this object here. We're going to have 3 different properties. One is I want an ID. I want a unique ID, and I'm going to use the time stamp from that exact moment when it was submitted as the ID. Now, you may want to use this to like order your lists or that kind of thing. I'm just going to use it as a simple ID, but I can grab this from new date, which again is a built-in in JavaScript. And then if I use the get time method here, we can actually pick off the exact milliseconds since epoch, which is like January 1st, 1970. So it'll store it as a raw number. Okay, so that's the first thing I want. The second thing is I want the actual text. Now the text we got from our new to-do. This was just the new to-do name technically, so let's maybe say new to-do name. We'll just drop this in as the text. And then finally, I want to know if it's been completed or not, so I can show if it's completed or not. So we're going to use the is completed like this. We'll just name it is completed and set it to false, because by default, when I create a new to-do, I expect it to not be completed, right? Finally here, let's save all of this to local storage. So we've got our existing ones, we've added our new one from the form that's been submitted, we've combined the 2 of them, and now I simply want to save it. Again, we've got local storage, which is built in by default, where we'll set the item instead of get the item in this case. We need to give it the same name that we're expecting later, which is to-dos, and then we're going to simply pass along the updated to-dos. If I do it like this, this is going to send it along as structured content. So if I come over here, we say like something like this, and I come over here, we look at the application, we look under local storage to-do, notice it says object. Not super helpful. So I actually have to convert this back into a string. And let's get rid of that. If I come back up top here, you'll see that we've used this JSON.parse to parse it from a string back into a structured object. We actually have another option available. This is JSON.stringify. All right. Very inventive name here where we're going to pass along the updated to-dos. So now if I come in here and say something, you'll notice that it's a string, which means I can actually read it inside of here. If I click in here, you'll see it has an ID. That's the timestamp. It's got a is completed, which is set to false, and then the text that I inserted here. All right, cool. Now we've got to update the UI in a couple of different ways. First of all, I want to reset the form. You'll notice even after I submit it, this just stays here. I don't want that. So let's come over here. We'll say to do form. So we're going to reselect the form .reset. And this is a method that lives on the form that will just reset the form. It'll clear out all the form inputs. And finally, I want to somehow add this to this section down this way. Now this gets a little bit more complex, and there's a couple of different ways we could do this. But what we're going to do is make sure that we fire off a custom event. So up top here, we have a built-in event called submit, but you can actually write your own custom events as well. So let's come up top here, and I'm going to add a custom event. So we'll say custom events just to kind of keep this section clean. We'll say render UI. So this is when we want to update the UI, and I'm going to set this to new custom event, and we'll give this custom event a name, which will be inventively here, render UI. All right, so whenever we hit render UI, I want to actually fire off some kind of custom event. So let's come back down this way, and that's what I want to add. I want to say document, so do this against the document. I want to dispatch an event, and this would be my own custom event called render UI. So this references this custom event right here. So I'm saying, hey, at the end of all this, fire off a custom event called render UI, which will then use this right here. So I can listen for this event and then do things based on that. What I want to do is listen for that event. So we're already kind of in our event listener section right here. Listeners, let's add another one. So the one we want to listen for is our custom event. And that's against the document, you might remember. So I'll say add event listener. We're going to listen for our custom event, which is render UI. Now, whenever this thing happens, I want to go ahead and do something. For simplicity's sake, why don't we just come in here and console.log something like rendered. That way we know it's actually working. So let's pull back up the console. You can do that with Command Shift or Command Option and J. And then I'll come inside here, we'll say like something, hit enter, and notice we get rendered here. And if I were to jump back over here to my application, you'll notice I've also got two items. They both say something. I probably should have thought about that, but we've now got both of them being added, and this custom event is being fired. So in other words, we're separating out the form submission from all the rendering of the UI. So whenever this event is fired, I want to do something. So let's think through that. First of all, I want to select the UL, the unordered list. Secondly, I want to get all my current to-dos, right? To-dos from the actual local storage. And then I want to like insert them, right? So every time it's rendered, I want to re-grab those to make sure I've got a fresh list. Now, again, as you're scaling to massive applications, there's better ways to handle this, but this is a basic implementation of it. Okay, so first of all, let's select the UL, and just to kind of keep everything together, let's select it up top here. So we'll say something like to-do list equals document.query selector, or we just want to select whatever that ID happened to be. So if I come back over here, remember, we gave this the ID of to-dos. That's what we want to use here as well. So I'll come back over here. We're going to add this. Remember, you have to do the pound sign because it's an ID. And now we've got access to the to-do list. So first thing complete, right? We've got the to-do list. Second thing I want to do is grab all the to-dos. Now we've got a nice little helper function to make that really, really easy. If I come back up here, let's see, where is it? Yeah, get local as JSON. We just want to get this exact same thing, and now we'll actually get it as structured data, which is what we want. So I'm going to come over here. We're going to grab our to-do list like this, and I want to set the inner HTML. We'll just use the get local as JSON and just add that as our HTML. Now, right now, this will not be HTML, so it's going to mess up. If I come over here and add something and hit enter, it's just going to say object, 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 and object, object. Why is that? Well, if you remember, if I jump back over here, you'll notice that these are all different objects inside of an array. And so we need to actually turn this object structure into an HTML structure. So what we're going to do is for each of the items in our list, each of these objects, we want to pass it to a function that will convert it to HTML. Now you can do this with the map method. We're going to pass each of these to something called create to do HTML. And then in a second here, we're going to need to join this, but for now, don't worry about it. We're going to come up top here and I want to add a couple things here. So let's say like rendering or something like that. And we'll say const, and what we called that create to do HTML. And here we're going to take in a certain structure. This would be a to do. And then here we're just simply going to return HTML. In this case, I want it to just be an HTML string, so I'm going to use these backticks because this will allow us to kind of add variables where we need, and it also allows us to do this on multiple lines. So what is the structure we want? Well, this is hard because you don't get a lot of IntelliSense here, but I want to first of all add an li like this. Since we're putting this inside of a UL, all the children need to be li tags. Over here, we're going to have a class of to-do. So each of these will have this class. Then I'm going to essentially have two items in here. First of all, we're going to have a div just to kind of structure out some stuff. I'll show you that in a second. And then finally, we're going to have a button down this way. This button will delete everything, and I'm going to add just the like X sign right here, this emoji, and we'll close this off, button like this. Now, this is not super accessible. In fact, if this is read out, this will not be helpful for screen readers, so I want to add one extra thing, and that would be an ARIA label, like this, ARIA label, and this will actually be what's read off by screen readers. So I could say delete, and then I could give it the actual name of the to-do if I wanted to. Now to use this string interpolation here, I have to use a $sign and then these kind of curly brackets where I'll pick off the to-do dot, and then you might remember we had text as one of those items. So the text of the to-do will show here, and I'll just say delete whatever the name of the thing is to do. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Then we'll come over here. We're going to add a couple other things. I want to add a class so I can style this in my CSS in a bit. So we'll say a delete button. And then I also want to have some identification so that when this button is clicked, I can figure out which button has been clicked. So to do that, we're going to use a custom data attribute. This will allow us to identify this particular button with its to-do. So here we're going to put this in quotation marks. And again, we've got this kind of interpolated string where we're going to have the to-do.id. The ID is just that timestamp. Now over here inside the div, we want to add a couple of other things. I'm going to add an input. This will actually have a type of checkbox. Checkboxes like this don't have closing tags. They're kind of self-contained like this. Now I want to associate this with its label here in a second, and I'll show you why. But let's come down this way. Let's add a label as well. This one is not a self-closing tag. So label like this. And inside here is where we're going to add our actual text. So here, this is again to do text like this. Now, if I add something new, you'll notice now all of these show up. Now we've got a few things to fix. We've got this something here, but if I click on this, it doesn't actually check it off. I have to actually check the button. So that's the first thing. And notice we've got these weird commas. What's going on here? So this is not a styling thing. This is actually like in the text. So what we want to do is first of all fix this first one. In order to associate this label with this input, I need an ID on the input and a label pointing to that ID. So these IDs should be unique per page. So let's pick a unique identifier for this. In this case, the ID we're going to pick is the ID of the to-do, right? So we'll come in here and do to-do.id, and that will select this as a unique identifier. Now, in order to link these two together, we're going to use the for attribute. We're going to point it over to that ID. So we'll say to-do.id, and this essentially links the two up together. So if I add something else new, now if I click on the text, it will actually select the box, right? So it will link the two together to where selecting this will check it, or the text itself says, hey, I know an input that's tied to my label. So if I click the label, go ahead and check off the ID. So that's the first thing. Now, what about our weird commas? Well, believe it or not, that's actually all the way down this way. When we're looping over these, a map, by default, this method returns an array of items. And when you try to add in an array of items inside of HTML here, it just does weird stuff. And that weird thing is it separates it by commas. So if we want to see what this looks like, we could say like new to-do list or something like that. I'm just going to copy this down. And now if I add a new one and I hit enter, let's pull up the console here. You'll see I get an array of items. They're each strings of HTML, which is what I expect. However, when I combine all of those, it's going to add commas in between them. Let's go back out this way, and we can remove this by setting the inner HTML to joining them on nothing. So when you combine all these items, don't do the default, which is combining them with a comma. Instead, just do nothing. So it'll actually just be a straight string of a bunch of LIs. So now if I add a new one, you'll notice that weird thing is gone. Just what we want. I should mention here that it's not typically good practice to add inner HTML directly because there's some security vulnerabilities you want to be aware of. In this case, it's all contained to the actual user. They're storing their own text in local storage. They're retrieving that from local storage. They can't hurt anyone else. This is tied to their particular browser. Even if they go and open this on their phone or a different computer, it will be different text for that individual device, or even on a different browser on the same computer. So this is why it's probably safe to use it here. Typically, you never want to trust a user to input anything without making sure you've cleaned up that data. That just protects you and your application generally. In this case, though, it should work just fine. So now we've actually got it rendering properly, but I want to add a couple of other things. If I come inside here, we add something, you'll notice I've got all these things showing. They're not yet styled properly, but I'm also struggling with the fact that I've got this kind of nasty button. Now, these buttons are very difficult to style, these checkboxes. So instead of relying on this, I want to get all the benefits. And one of the benefits is I can tab through and select them by default. This happens with the browser. You also get a lot of accessibility benefits by using an input, but I actually want the styling to be something different. So what we're going to do is use a class here. We're going to call this checkbox. And then next to the input, I want to add one more thing, and that is going to be a div. It could be anything, but we're going to just use a div here. We'll call this fake checkbox. Now, the reason I do this is because it's a lot easier to style a div to make it look however I want. So we'll actually use this for our functionality, but this will actually be displaying what it should look like. So with that said, what we're going to do is grab all this and style it with CSS. Now you might remember I actually added this earlier over this way, just like that. And this is the exact structure we're going to use. So just to make it easier to actually style it, let's just leave that in there permanently. So every time I save, I don't have to enter something to add a new to-do. So right now we're not using our stored to-dos. We're using that hard-coded to-do. All right, now if we remember, if I come back over here, you'll notice that each of these LIs have a class of to-do. We did that so that we could select it in our CSS. So I want to style the actual inputs. I want to use display flex. These should set all those items next to each other. And it actually gets rid of that dot as well, the little marker, the list item. So that's good as well. And we'll set a gap here. And let's go ahead and use our space 4 as well. And that will space it out by that amount. Now next, I want to use align items. We're going to center everything. That centers it up and down. Then I also want to justify content, and we're going to space between. Now what this will allow is for this delete to be all the way over to the right and everything else to be here. Now if we look back at the structure we've got, this is its own little section, and the button is its own section. What we've done is separated these things out, but this section in here still isn't separated out as we like. So let me come back down here, and inside the to-do, I can select my checkbox. Now, again, I kind of go 2 levels deep, perhaps. I know these checkboxes will only ever be inside my to-dos, so I'm going to say anytime I've got a checkbox inside of a to-do, style it this way. Now, I want to use position of relative here, and that's because I want the actual input here to kind of span this whole section. So anywhere I click inside of here, it will actually check that checkbox off. I'll show you that here in a second, but we'll say position of relative. And then I want to use a lot of the same elements. So we'll have display flex, so they go next to each other. We're going to have a gap here, and I'm going to use my spacing 3 variable. And then once again, I want it to be aligned vertically. So I'll say align items, and we'll do center. Now, this actually doesn't span the full width currently, I don't think. So if I say like, let's just check. If I say border, this is a nice little trick, by the way. You can say border, 1 pixel, solid, and red. Yeah, it doesn't span the whole way. So I actually want to add here a width of 100%. So it takes up the full width it can take up. And now you see it takes up that whole section. Now, I actually want the button inside of here, this thing right here, to span this whole amount. So that's the next thing we're going to think about. So inside the checkbox, and again, we're kind of getting a little deeper than I typically like to get, but I know these are going to be super scoped to only using to-dos like this, or only using checkboxes like this. Now, it's possible that I have fake checkboxes set up somewhere else, so I may actually want to extract this out. In fact, I think I might do that. And that way, if you use checkboxes in your site like this, and you name them with that class of checkbox, then these would work outside of a to-do LI. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. Basically, nesting too much can really mess you up. So we're going to just try to nest 2 levels deep only. I'm going to come in here with an input. And here we'll have a position of absolute. And I want it to be top, right, left, and 0. So I'm going to say inset. That's a shorthand for all those 0. Now what this does is basically mean that if I click over here, this button, even though this checkbox, even though it's sitting in the middle, actually covers this entire kind of red outlined area. And that allows me, notice even as I hover, it kind of changes colors by default. That allows me to click anywhere inside here and check off the to-do. So that's essentially what we're doing with this input here. Now I do want to add a couple of other things as well. That is, I want to add a cursor of pointer. And I'm also going to change the opacity here, opacity to 0. Now by doing that, it removes the checkbox, and that's why we've got our fake one. Because as I click here, I can't tell if it's checked or not, right? Let's get rid of this right here just so we don't have that nasty border. And next to the input, you might remember we added a fake checkbox that I creatively named fake checkbox, right? So we're going to use this and style it. So I'll come inside here and say we've got a fake checkbox now, and this is what we want to style. So first of all, let's set the width here, and I want to set this width to my checkbox size. That was a variable we set up at the very beginning. So it's actually taking up space. You can't really see it right now. So let's add a border, and here we'll do 1 pixel solid, and I'm going to use my HSL, and we'll use our accent, and we'll do like 0.4 or something. Now, right now you can see it's kind of flat, right? And not really a box. So I can set the height as well, or I can use something called aspect ratio and just set this to 1/1. This tells it, hey, make it a whole size like that. Now we can change this value as we want. We can make it the full blue color if we want. I just set it to kind of a slight offset there. Maybe let's increase this to like 2. That makes sense. All right, next, it's possible that as this text gets larger, that it kind of smashes this box over a little bit because it's a flexed child. There are ways inside of a flex container to say, don't let this thing shrink at all. And that would be by using flex shrink and setting this to 0. It's set to 1 by default, which means it will shrink a little bit. Here I'm saying don't shrink at all. Finally, I want to add a border radius, and here we're going to use rounded of small. So it's just got a nice little rounding to it. I would like to transition a few different things. So let's use the transition here. We're going to grab the background color. We'll do 200 milliseconds, ease in and out. And then if you do a comma, you can actually add another one as well. So we'll do box shadow, same kind of thing, 200 milliseconds, ease in and out. So we'll use this on both of these. So what I want to do is when I actually select the checkbox, I want to fill this thing in. Now here's where some cool stuff comes in with CSS. Let's start first of all, before we consider checking it, and we just look at what happens when we hover or focus on it. So we'll say input is, here we're going to have hover, or we're going to have focus visible. Now we're saying input because we're inside of our checkbox, so this is only going to apply to those kinds of inputs. This is function here allows us to pass in multiple different selectors. So whenever any of these is true, here's what I want you to do. We're going to take the input and say, grab the fake checkbox next to it and do something to that. So whenever I hover or focus on it, I want you to do something. Now, again, these selectors could be a little gnarly, but we're going to select the parent. In this case, this would be the input. And then I want to select the thing next to it. So here you could use either the plus, which grabs just the next thing over, or you can actually use the tilde as well. This will select all of its general siblings like this. In this case, let's just select the next one over. We'll say the fake checkbox here. So whenever I hover over the actual input, do something to the fake checkbox. Now I want to do a couple of things. Let's see, do we have a background on here? No, we don't. Okay, so that wasn't going to help me, but I will go ahead and grab right here. We're going to grab this one right here. We'll say the background color. And I want to simply set this to something like that. Actually, let's keep it the same way. So that way it's kind of like, oh, I'm checking it. Do you want to check that? Maybe let's make it a little bit lighter. And it's transitioning because we set a transition right here. Now, the other thing I want to do is set a box shadow as well. Now, we had a nice little box shadow up top here, so let's grab this. This might be a helpful starting point, and I'm going to drop this down this way. In other words, as I come over here, it's going to actually add a little box shadow around that as well. So I might actually back this off just a touch, and we're going to do one more thing here, which is I'm going to copy this, drop it down here, and I'm going to add a label. So I'm going to say I've also got the label here, and I want to add a couple of things. Whenever I hover over this, I want to do some stuff to this label. So first of all, I want to take text decoration, and I want to set this to line through. That way, if I hover over here, it kind of shows there's a line going through it. I don't actually see this happening. That's because I said it had to be the next thing, so this would be a good option for that other selector, the general sibling. So now I'm saying, hey, just grab the general sibling next to it and add a line through it. I've also got the text decoration color, and here I want to set this to one of those colors. We'll use the accent color, and let's back this off a bunch like we did up here. So now it's just going to be a real light line. That's almost too light to see though. So let's add text decoration one more time. We're going to add thickness. And in this case, we'll do like 0.2 so it's a little bit larger. And now you see it kind of showing up there. Maybe that's still a little bit too light. So I don't know, let's add like 0.4. There we go. So now you can kind of see, oh, it's gonna check it off, but I haven't done that yet. Okay, so the last thing to do is to say what happens when this gets checked. So let me copy this down. We'll paste this one more time. Except in this case, what I'm interested in is whenever this thing is checked, not simply when it's hovered or visibly focused. So here we're going to treat these a little bit differently, but I'm going to use the checked selector. So instead of saying is here, we're going to use checked like this. And now I want to grab the sibling selector. So let's come up top here, remove all this, and we're just going to say grab the fake checkbox next to it. Let's get rid of all this as well, like that. So we're just saying whenever this is checked, do something to the fake checkbox. Well, what do I want to do? I want to change the background color. And in this case, I actually just want to make it the full accent color. So now if this is checked, it'll stay checked just like that. That's what I want, right? So I want it to actually look like it's checked off. Now you could add extra things like a check mark or whatever, but we're just going to say when it's filled in, that means we're set, right? Now let's actually copy this down one more time like this, and I want to also grab the label. Now in this case, again, we need to use the general sibling selector since it's not the next thing right next to it, and I want to grab the label. Now I want to adjust all of these things here. Now I want to grab all of these things here and I want to paste them in here. We're going to keep a couple of them the same. So it'll still have a line through, the thickness will be the same, but I actually want this to be the full accent as well. So the color will be straight up, right? So now it'll actually just stay blue and totally checked out. Now you can make that slightly opaque if you want to, like that. That's fine as well, but I'm going to keep it all the way. All right, now let's come down here. The last thing we're going to do is add some styling for the delete button. So delete button. And it's not inside the checkbox, so it needs to be outside here. And here, we can't actually change the font size because it's an emoji, so we'll change the font size here to our small, like that. And that should make it a little bit tinier. Then let's change the background color, and this will just be transparent. So we don't want it to have any color. We'll just take on whatever color is behind it. Now, as you can see, there's a border by default on buttons. Let's get rid of that. So we'll say border is none. And you might have some of this as like basic styling for all buttons on your site, but in this case, we're just going to set it on the single one because that's all we've got. Now we've also got a few other things. I want to set the width, and we're going to use our same checkbox size variable. Remember, we had this set for this. We're going to do the same thing over here. So we want this height and width to be the same. In fact, let's comment this out just so you can kind of see. So width will be there. We'll use the same aspect ratio trick where we'll go 1/1, which should make it that exact size as a square. Now, it may be that it's not exactly in the center here. Depends on kind of a couple of other factors. So we can go ahead and make sure it's in the center by using display grid, and then we'll use place items center. This takes all the grid children and puts them in the very center of their individual cell. Now, so it should be in the exact center. It should be the same size as this right over here. Now, even though we don't have a border on it, we're going to remove that here. We do want to have a border radius, so that way when we show like that box shadow we're going to show on focus, it has the same kind of, footprint basically as that one right there. So we'll come over here and use the same one of rounded small. And then lastly here, we're going to transition on two items, both the opacity and also on the box shadow. So we'll do ease in, out, and then we'll do kind of the same thing that we've done before on the box shadow. So let's just copy all this. I'll do a comma, add all this, and then we'll just say box shadow. Typically speaking, you should like limit your transitions to just the items you need instead of doing like all transition, because it's just a little bit more expensive, but it's not a huge deal. If you want to just say all 200 ease in and out, that's fine as well. So let's get rid of the border. And now if I come over here and I focus on it, we've got this kind of default blue. And again, I might want to change that, and we can actually steal some of what we did up top here. So right here is what we're going to want. The background color, we're going to change a little bit. We'll change the opacity as well, but I'm going to go ahead and steal this. And we'll come in here, delete button. And we're going to say that whenever the parent is, and then we're going to use the same kind of idea here, where we say it has hover or it has focus visible. So it's been tabbed to. Then what we want to do is change a few things. I want to change the opacity to 0.7, so 70%. I want to change the outline here to transparent, and change the outline to transparent. And then we're going to set the box shadow to what I just copied in. So that way, if I come over here and we focus on it, I come over here, there we go. Now to me, it feels like this needs to be a little bit more intense on this one. I don't know why, but let's do that. So now it's slightly more branded to kind of our colors on our app. Now I am seeing that this to-do app isn't spaced out as much as I would like. So let me make sure that we've actually set this up properly. We're using the wrapper, the main tag is what I need here, and to separate these two. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to come back over this way, and we'll come up to the main, which I don't think we actually have one for. So that's probably some of it. We could either add some padding or margin at the top. It'd be margin is what you'd add on the top of this section here, or we can just make the main here a grid itself. So maybe let's do that. So I'll come inside here. We're going to say that this main tag should be display grid. And here we can set a gap here of like the 4. Perfect. Okay, so now we've got all the CSS we need. We've got this text working properly. We can click here. We aren't handling though, saving what happens when you click here. Notice I'll click and then I hit refresh and it loads it back in as it was. Now, partly that's because I've got this hard-coded, which we don't want anymore. So let me get rid of this. And again, you didn't have to do that. That was just to make it easier to actually style. Now, right now, the only time we're actually rendering the UI is when I add something new. So if I add something new, now you'll see it renders all the UI and it shows all the individual items here. Even though it looks like it saved it, when I hit refresh, it just clears them all out. So we need to handle a couple of things. Number one, the initial page load. And then we also need to save or perpetuate whenever we check something, that it actually stays checked. And when we delete something, that it deletes. So we can do all of that in the JavaScript. So let's come back over this way. And because we've got some nice helpers, it's not too bad to get started with. So we're listening for render UI, and then we're firing off this right here. But we can also do something like dispatching an event whenever the DOM content itself actually loads. So let's do that. We'll say window like this. This grabs the entire browser window, and we're going to set an event listener on that. And the event we're listening for is simply called DOM content loaded, just like that. Now, whenever that happens, we want to make sure that we dispatch this event right here. So once that loads, I'm going to fire off this function. So our function should then fire this off and render the UI. Now, because we've got this nice little helper that takes care of all the rendering, we can just literally fire the event. This captures it and sets the inner HTML of our to-do list. So now when I refresh, you'll see that everything just updates as you'd expect straight from the local storage. Now, by my account, that means we have just two things left to do. One is to make sure that once we check something, it stays checked. So we have to actually change our local storage. And then also when I click delete, it actually deletes that item. So for both of those, we want to listen to the items. Now, as you might remember, here we have a bunch of these LIs. I've got buttons here. I've also got inputs, and I want to listen to what happens to these. The problem is when the JavaScript loads, if it goes to try to grab these items, they will not be there in the DOM. In other words, if I came over here, let's try to grab all the checkboxes. So let's do this. We'll say const check boxes equals document. And you can do a query selector all in this case, where we'll select all of the checkboxes. Now, right now you can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So 9 of these should show. However, if I go ahead and try to console log this and we open up the console, you'll notice it's a node list of 0. Why is that? Well, when the JavaScript loads, none of this is yet in the HTML. It's actually the JavaScript that puts it there. So before it ever gets to putting it there, it checks to see, hey, did these exist? And the answer is no. So we can't attach event listeners to things that don't exist. We do, however, have something that we could attach an event listener to. and it's actually this right here, this to-dos. So these to-dos are already on the page when the JavaScript loads. So what we can do is attach one event listener for this entire section, and then check to see when we click inside that section, what we've clicked on. So that's a kind of a way to get around it. It's called event propagation. So back over this way, let's go ahead and come down here. We've got this that listens to the form. We've got a window event listener for the DOM content loaded, and the thing that actually listens for rendering the UI. Let's add one more. And in this case, what we're going to do is add this to-do list. So we're going to grab that to-do list and add an event listener on that, where we listen to the item that's been clicked on. So we'll say click, and then I just want to grab whatever the browser gives us back. Usually this is E or event, however you want to name that is fine, just that the browser is going to give you back whatever's been clicked on. Now inside here, let's go ahead and console log e.target. And in fact, let's make this a little easier. I'm going to console log an entire object here where you have target. This will be e.target. And then we also are going to have current target, and this will be e.current target. Now, the reason I'm doing this is so you can understand what we're actually going to listen to. So if I come over here and we start clicking around, you're going to notice some things are going to get console logged. So if I click right here, notice it's saying I've clicked on the actual input, but the current target is the whole UL. Now, if I click over here, notice I've clicked on the delete button, but the current target is the UL. If I click anywhere I want in here, it doesn't matter where I click. If it's inside this UL, the current target will always be the UL. The target is the actual item I've clicked on within that UL. So which of these would I want to use? The current target or the target? Well, I'm going to want to use the target, right? Because I want to see which item I've clicked on inside of the thing that the event listener was set on, which is the to-do list. Now, before we do too much more, I want to know that when I've clicked on something, I can actually identify which item in my to-do list it is. So let's come back up top here. You'll notice that I've got like a label and an input, and I've got an ID here, but this one has this data ID attribute. So it'd be nice if they both had kind of the same structure, so I could pick it off both of those. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's add the same data ID attribute up here. So that way I can just say, hey, whatever I've clicked on, I know it will either be this input since it's like positioned absolute in this whole section, or it will be this button. And I know they both should have data ID attributes. And these data IDs point to the actual ID of the item. So let's scroll back down here. Now that I know I have that on either of these, I can pick that off of the e.target. So there's several ways you can do this in JavaScript, like most of things in JavaScript. Probably the easiest thing would just be to destructure the ID. And we're going to grab this from the e.target.dataset. That's the way you pick off all custom data attributes. Now, if this is confusing, if destructuring is confusing, we could also call this an ID and pick it off e.target.dataset.id. That would work as well. All I'm doing is basically destructuring this, pulling it off this object and saying, just give me this. And it kind of saves me like two keystrokes. But if that's confusing, don't worry about it. Now, I want to do a little check here to basically say that if the thing that I've clicked on, the e.target, does not have an ID, I just want to return. So I want to jump out of this loop. I don't want to do anything else, right? Now, right now, the way it's set up, it's probably not going to be that case. I don't know if that I could even click somewhere that doesn't exist. So let's come over here and say console.log. We'll say like clicked. So there's not enough padding or anything where I can actually click on something inside the UL that's not one of these items. So maybe let's add that real quick. So let's come over here. I'm going to say padding of like, I don't know, 4 rem or something to make it huge. And now if I click over here, notice nothing is being console logged. However, as soon as I click here, it says clicked. So in other words, I just want to double check that whatever I'm clicking on has an ID, that data ID, the custom data attribute. And the reason we name it data dash whatever is because it basically protects us from like being overwritten later by the HTML spec. Right now, there's data attributes are like a really safe way. Where's my data attribute? Up top here. Data attributes are a really safe way to write custom stuff. Anytime you have data dash, this is kind of set off as its own little thing, and you can name these whatever you want, and the HTML spec will never overwrite those. So typically, if you're reaching for something kind of custom, you'll use these data dash whatever attributes. There are a couple tricky things about them, especially with capitalization and spaces and that kind of thing. But right now, we're just using this very simple ID, which means we can pick it off the what's called the data set. Okay, back over here, let's get rid of that padding so that it looks kind of nice. And we'll jump back over this way and scroll back down. Okay, so now that we know we're in here, there's basically 2 things we have to worry about. On the one hand, we would have to update our to-dos. And then on the other hand, we might want to delete the to-do. So in updating, we're just going to set whether or not it's checked. Now you remember the way we stored this over here, that each of these have a is completed. And they're all set to false by default. And when I click here, the UI changes because we're using an input and we're checking it, but it doesn't actually update the data. So when I refresh, it's back as you were. So that's what we want to change next. So I'm going to pull up the console again. That way we can see a couple things that we want to do. And the first thing I want to do is see if it contains a certain class. Now we don't have that on it currently. So let's go ahead and add that. So I'm going to come up top here, and on the input here, we're just going to add a class. And this class will be checkbox input. Now you could also add a data-type or something like that, and say if it has an ID, then check the type. And that's also a possibility if you want to do it that way. Again, JavaScript gives you lots of flexibility, and you can kind of do what you want. And the patterns are really up to you and kind of what ends up being kind of industry standards. This is what I would probably do in this instance. And I'm just going to pick off that individual class. So I'll just say if e.target.classlist.contains. So we're going to say, give me all the classes on whatever I've clicked on. And if it has checkbox of input, that's the one we just added, then we need to think through what we want to do. So first of all, I want to get the to-dos. Then I want to locate the one I clicked on. Then I want to change it to the opposite of whatever the check status is. And then finally, I want to resave. And at the end, we want to go ahead and dispatch our event, right? So that's what we want to do. So let's come over here, first of all, and get all the to-dos. Now we already know how to do that. Well, we could say existing to-dos, and we're going to set this equal to our get local as JSON, and we'll simply pass in the key of to-dos. Right? That's that little helper function we wrote up above. Now, we should think through this a little bit here, because really the first thing we're doing is updating the to-dos. But either way, we're going to have to get this. So why don't we just move this up top here? And that way we've already got access to it. So we've kind of already done number one. So next, we want to locate the thing that we clicked on. So we could say updated to-dos. So let's add a new variable here. We'll call it updated to-dos. And all we're going to do is take our existing to-dos and we're going to map over those. Now map is basically just going to be a little factory where we go over each item in that array and we do something to it. And in the end, we get an array. So here I'm going to take the to-do, that's what I'll call it. You can call it whatever you want. And in this little arrow function, we're just going to check on something. We're going to check if the to-do.id equals the number that was passed in. Now the number is right here. However, this is just a string the way we've gotten this. In fact, if I come over here, you can see this. Let's remove that so we don't get yelled at. If I come and click here, the number is just a string. Even though it looks like a number right here, it's just a string. Now I can actually wrap this in parse int, or even just the number function like this. And you'll notice now, if I click on something, it is purple. That tells you it's a number. I know that's not super helpful, like the distinction between those two, but generally speaking, you can check a couple different ways as well, but we'd be comparing a string to an actual number. So what I want to do is convert this to a number first. So what we're going to do is come back down here and say number, and we'll pass in the ID. So now what we're checking is we're saying for the to-do we're looping over, does the ID I'm looping over, is that the same thing as the thing I've clicked on? If it is, we're going to do another little ternary. Maybe to make this easier, we'll put this on separate lines. One thing will happen if it's true. The other thing will happen if it's false. So what's going to happen if it's true? Well, if it is the thing I've clicked on, then what I want to do is I want to spread in that to do. So whatever the thing is that I'm looping over, put all of its properties in there. Then I want to take is completed and I'm going to overwrite that. So I'm going to say is completed is going to be equal to the opposite of whatever to-do.isCompleted is. So if it's true, make it false. If it's false, make it true. Now by spreading this in first and then afterwards changing it, we're basically just saying, give me what it is, then change the final thing. And this will override is completed that's currently being spread in over here. Now, if it's not the thing I'm looping over, if the thing I clicked on is not the item that I'm currently looping over, just return the to-do like this. Now this will give me an updated array of items where the one item I clicked on has this property is completed flipped. So we did number 2 as well. And we did number 3, right? Now that means the last thing I have to do is to resave it. So here we're going to use our local storage.set item, and we're going to set to-dos, that's the name we gave it, to our updated to-dos. But remember, this is now an object, it's not a string. So we've got a JSON.stringify it like this. We'll pass in our updated to-dos. Now the last thing we need to do is to dispatch the event. But again, remember, we've got to do this no matter what. So just kind of like we did a second ago where we first got all this stuff, why don't we just come down here below and say document.dispatch. And here we just want to render the UI. Now this is actually not going to work and we'll figure out why in a second. But if I come over here and click, you'll notice nothing's actually changing. Well, let's come over here to the application and see what's happened. So we've got is completed. Let's see all those. True, false. So it is actually changing here, right? is completed is true. Now this one's going to be true. Those are both true. So why isn't it updating here? Well, the reason is we haven't actually handled it in the actual code we're saying. We're not saying whether or not it's checked. So what I want to do is set it to checked or not checked based on what the data actually tells me. Now here's the thing. If we do checked like this, even if we say checked equals false, like this, it will still check it. Because anytime you have the checked attribute at all, it's going to check it. So we actually need to decide whether or not to show the checked attribute based on whether or not it is checked in the database, right? It's not really a database, but you get what I'm saying. So let's do a little check here. And since we're in JavaScript, I'm going to have this little template syntax where we check if to-do dot is completed. If that's true, then I want to do something. Again, we'll use a little ternary. All I want to do is add the string checked. Now you can do checked equals true or pizza, or it doesn't really matter, but as long as you have checked in there, that works. If it's not true, I just want to have an empty string. So notice now that I save it, it all renders properly. I can come in here and check, and it will actually work. And if I refresh, look at that, it actually pulls in the right thing and checks it or not checks it based on this data, right? Not on whether I just happen to click at that moment. In other words, it's actually loading in the data. And when I toggle it by clicking it, we've gone ahead and hit this right here, where we've seen that it has an ID. We've then figured out which ID it is. We've flipped the status and then resaved it. And then we fired off our render UI event. Now, by my account, that means we have just one more thing to do, and that is we're going to do something very similar. So let's grab all this. And for the delete to do here, it's not a checkbox here. Now it's called delete button. Why am I naming it that? Well, that's the class we gave it up top here, delete button. So anytime it has the delete button right here, I want to do the same kind of thing. Now this is a little simpler because all we want to do is exclude the one item where the to-do matches here. So instead of using map, we're going to actually use filter. And here we need to do the opposite check. We're going to say if it doesn't match the thing I clicked on, keep it, otherwise get rid of it. So by filtering out the item I clicked on, I now have a new array with only the items that still exist, the item I haven't clicked on. Then we're going to save it to local storage, and then we're going to dispatch our event. So now I should be able to come in here and click, and notice it just deletes them right away. So it's deleting it from the data, and it's also deleting it from the UI. Now, the reason it's deleting it from the UI is because it's re-rendering the UI each time. Now, there are other ways to handle this, but I think this custom event is a really nice pattern to have in place, and it helps you separate out rendering from the actual data. So one more time, we're going to say finish video. And just like that, you can check it off. Hey, well, I hope that was a big help and you really enjoyed the process of working through all of that. If you're interested in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript tutorial videos that are more basic like this, let me know. I really enjoy teaching through these things, and they help me make sure that I'm choosing good design patterns as well. Well, thanks so much. I'll catch you in the next one. Happy coding.